I said, why don't you just call it Brightbox? We have Bright everything else. And he just kind of took that and ran with it. And then the next thing I saw a few weeks later, we're launching Brightbox. And I'm like, oh, cool.
That's great. Hey there, Solar Warriors. I'm Nico Johnson, and this is Suncast. Each week, I pull back the veil on the life and business insights of clean tech entrepreneurs building the most noble and impactful companies of our time. I hope what you learn from this conversation is a catalyst for your own growth. So thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our tribe. Hey, welcome back, Solar Warriors. It's another Thursday, and I'm honored that you're joining me this week for our Intrapreneur's story, and it's a doozy. Did you ever wonder how ideas like the SunRun Brightbox storage product and program got their start? Well, today's Intrapreneur and Solar OG, Paul Dailey, has had a hand in that bright idea and more in his more than 2-decade career in the solar coaster. We're going to dig into his journey to get to Director of Product Strategy at Outback, some of the twists and turns along the way, and the carefully curated and practical steps that he took to craft his role in this booming market, as well as how he has scaled up from the world of solar to distribution to energy storage broadly. Committed listeners, of course, will recall that we just had Paul on last week for a Tactical Tuesday on storage trends. I think that's an episode not to be missed, so if you did miss it, I hope you'll bookmark it for later as well. If you love this episode, then you should check out the more than 275 additional founders' stories and startup advice over at mysuncast.com and sign up to receive a notification when the next episode or additional magical goodie has dropped in your favor. For now, get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune into another powerful conversation with Paul Dailey here on Suncast. All right, Solar Warriors. Today, we're going to jump into a conversation with recent alum Paul Dailey of Outback Power. Perhaps you caught the Tactical Tuesday episode that Paul and I did, diving into his 10 predictions for solar and storage in the 2020s. Today, we're going to dive into his career of the last 20 plus years. It is my pleasure to spend some time again with Paul. Paul, welcome back to Suncast.
Thanks, Nico. I really enjoyed the last one and look forward to a fun conversation.
Indeed. For those who are unfamiliar, Paul has spent his 20-plus year career developing, marketing, and deploying distributed generation technologies. We're going to talk a bit about how that got going and how he found himself as an intrapreneur in our industry. But he's been always focused on homes and businesses getting better control over how and where and their energy comes from and how they use it. It's such an interesting background, Paul. So I'm interested to dive into the winding path that has led you to Outback. But for those who maybe don't know you, haven't looked at your LinkedIn, can you give us a sense of how and why you maybe discovered or found yourself in the world of energy and how that became clean energy and you kind of figured out this is where you wanted to focus on your career? Yeah,
it's interesting. When I was in high school, I went to high school in Eastern Washington, and the local school district had a fairly unique program that placed seniors in internship positions out at the Hanford site. And so I was placed in the nuclear plant as part of the what's called regulatory services, right? So the NRC kind of guys. And my job was to run around and get my friends' parents to sign off on documents that change the safety analysis documentation for the plant. And just looking around, here's this plant. It's a gigawatt and change, and there's 1,000, 2,000 people there. You had 3 buildings and they're all full most of the time, and you have these guys going in and out of the power block. I was driving to Portland one time, and I decided to detour and go get the dam tour at Bonneville. And here I go to walk in Bonneville Dam. It's about half of the capacity of the nuclear plant, but there's like 50 people running the whole thing. And I just remember thinking, and this is my 18-year-old self. I'm going, what the hell are we doing over there? This is a way more economical way to generate power. And, you don't have a gazillion safety people and all this kind of stuff that you need, when you're dealing with something like nuclear energy. That kind of got the wheels turning. I hadn't decided yet to do energy as a career, I at that time still planned to go into robotics. And so spent a lot of my time in college researching, robotics and things like that, but very tangential. I mean, energy was kind of part of what you learned. And then when I graduated, I was offered a really compelling position at Infinia, which at the time was called Sterling Technology Company. And, I was a R&D engineer building Sterling engines, which is kind of a dream job for a graduating engineer. And so my very first project was working on a DOE grant to generate power from wood pellets. Right, so we had the Sterling engine, which is a heat engine. For those that aren't familiar, Sterling is an external combustion engine. So you burn something, or you get some heat source, and you heat up one end and you cool the other end, and then you get mechanical energy, or in our case, power out the other end. And so I spent a lot of time with gasifiers and all these crazy biomass things, and dug into the whole manure, allure, poo power realm of the world before we eventually made the business decision to shift into solar. And so that kind of launched my interest in solar, and it kind of went from there.
Yeah, you said before in a previous call that your role was aligning grants with commercial destination of products. I've never heard anybody say it quite like that. Could you help me understand, as a product guy, how you kind of came to that conclusion that was your job at Infinia?
I was tapped fairly early on as the guy writing the grants for the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And so this is a great program for anybody who's starting out with any kind of technology business. You can go online, and all the different government agencies will have a set aside for small business research. And you can go and apply for these grants, assuming that whatever you're building is close enough to something they want to do. Now, the secret to this program is that you can't just go and look when the grants come out and then apply for something. I mean, you have to do that, but you have to start figuring out, okay, who are the principal investigators at these agencies? What are they really looking to accomplish? You need to call them, and you have to call them outside of the grant area. You're not allowed to call them between the time the grant applications are published and the time that the grant solicitations are published and the time you get your application in it. You have to call them outside of that time. But you get a hold of these guys and you start talking to them about, well, here's what I can do for you. Here's what my technology can do for your agency and your mission. So ours was pretty obvious. We had a lot of stuff with DOE. We had a lot of stuff with NASA. And most interestingly, we had a lot of interactions with the National Institute for Science and Technology, because we also made cryocoolers. And so, those were the kinds of things. And then all the military ones, right? So we did a lot of work, powering UUVs, so unmanned underwater vehicles. One of my favorite was a field kitchen that made power while it boiled potatoes. If you talk to these guys ahead of time, they'll coach you, and you can kind of influence them to say, hey, if you put out a solicitation that's asking for this, then, my technology or my company can really help here. And they'll put the solicitation out. Now, they can't automatically award it to you. It's competitive. But, if you're clear about what you can do and what they need and have that conversation, well, it's going to come out and it's going to be as tailored for you as possible, so that you should have an advantage in responding to it. And so, we had this kind of successful program where we were doing all this stuff. I had a pretty good track record. I was winning about 1 out of 3 of these things, which, in that industry was considered, pretty darn good. And then, we got a new CEO in who wanted to take a much more strategic approach to this. And he said, we're only going to go after the grants that will lead to a product that we can commercialize and not depend on the government to pay for. And I'm like, well, that makes sense. And so, we started getting much more focused. We narrowed it down, to our space power program, and we started working on solar related stuff. So you could take, because it's a heat engine, you could take a big parabolic dish and you could concentrate the sun energy, on the Sterling engine and actually generate power that way. And this was back in 2003, 2004, when, you were putting in solar and it was still $10 a kilo or a watt.
And when everyone thought that concentrated solar was going to be the utility scale method.
Exactly. We were sort of right in there. The challenge was our building block was 1 to 3 kilowatts, so it wasn't the huge one. So we had a kind of more of a commercial type product. And eventually, going through all this stuff, I realized that, PV was making strides much faster than the concentrating stuff was. And so I eventually jumped shipped and went to SolarWorld, which was one of the bigger, PV manufacturers at that time, having just acquired the Shell facility.
Just want to go back a little bit in context and history for those who are unfamiliar. A lot of the cultural references, a lot of the even geographical references for Paul might be foreign to those on the East Coast, or certainly those outside the United States. So the Hanford site, for many in the Western region of the United States, would automatically tell you that he's in Washington. And we can go into the context of the history of the Hanford site. I'll link to a Wikipedia page that'll give you all the information that is actually quite riveting of how the Hanford nuclear reactor site was part of the Manhattan Project. It's where the vast majority of plutonium was manufactured in the United States for all of our arsenal, and where the first nuclear bomb, plutonium was created, et cetera. But in Washington has a long history in the solar industry of having a series of manufacturing sites that get passed from hand to hand. And what you just recently mentioned was how SolarWorld being a German manufacturer, had acquired a shell plant that itself has its own history in the state of Washington of being a manufacturing site. So I think that's really, really interesting that you decided. Was it like geographical coincidence or preference that you decided to go to SolarWorld out of Infinia because you want to stay there in Washington?
It was actually kind of the reverse. My wife wanted to be in California, and so the role that they offered me was at the Camarillo facility, which, this is the plant that goes all the way back to like the Arco days.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the Arco plant. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see those like the modules that they gave to Governor Brown recently. Those came out of that plant.
That's right.
I worked with the guys that made that stuff. So it was a really good time. It was actually a great entry point for solar PV because I'm working for Raji Anamandra, was literally there back in the 70s when they rolled the whole thing out. He'd worked for Charlie Gay and some of the names that everyone knows. So that was, it was great because I was surrounded by all these pioneers, right? I got to meet, David Katz and Coley Judd and all the guys. And if you've seen Jeff Spees' film, like I got to meet most of those guys, through that gig. Through
working, yeah.
Yeah. And later on, David Katz invited me to come to AEE. And so then I was really in the thick of it.
Before we jump to AEE, the SolarWorld brand and heritage of Arco Solar and everything that was sort of came before it is one that has been, I'd say, in large part forgotten by like the modern day solar advocates who just see SolarWorld as the company that filed a trade case. Looking at the time that you were there, it seems like you left either just before or right around the time the trade case came out. The trade case, of course, being one that was a tariff eventually imposed on Chinese cells because SolarWorld claimed that it was unfair pricing and it was driving companies like SolarWorld and U.S. manufacturing out of business. I have a two-part question. One, you are a product engineer and a project engineer, but the role that you served at SolarWorld was that of marketing manager. So through the lens, I'm curious how you were attracted to being a marketing manager from being a project engineer and being an engineering major, and then through the lens of a marketing manager whose job it is to create collateral, if you will, or spin, or to communicate to the audience the message of a company. I'm curious your perspective of the SolarWorld brand and trade case and all of that.
I went to the marketing role after getting my MBA, which Infinia had kindly allowed me to do. They even paid for most of it. So I worked for them for another couple of years after that, and then before I went to SolarWorld, and for a number of years I was the U.S. marketing guy. So my initial task was, hey, we just bought this shell plant. It's got this great heritage. We want to try to bring that along to the new brand, and had some kind of clever ads and things we did there. It was pretty low budget by today's standards. We had a few ads in Solar Pro and Home Power magazines. Those kind of mostly print advertising and trade shows. We finally worked up to multimedia advertising. Toward the end of my time there. But yeah, the trade case was interesting. When I started, SolarWorld had a pretty commanding market share in the U.S. and a lot of really loyal installers. And I think they never really lost that. There's still installers today that will tell you, hey, those were the best modules ever made and so on and so forth. And I think that reputation was not unearned. I mean, they spent a lot of time and quality was very much a focus. I mean, it's getting bought by the Germans. They had been Siemens before, it was Arco, Siemens, and then Shell, so, especially in the Siemens days, you had a lot of those quality programs. Siemens was the first company to offer a 25-year module warranty, because they wanted to show how much they believed in the quality of the product. And throughout that time, you had a pretty similar set of leaders, so like I said, Raji Anamandra had been there the whole time. There were a couple of his lieutenants that had been there for most of that time. And so there was a lot more continuity than you might expect. So here we are, we're cranking away, things are going great. And then it's 2009, 2010, I think it was right at the beginning of 2010, you had all the Chinese module suppliers drop their prices almost in lockstep. I mean, they went down $1 a watt like within a week, all of them. And so we're scratching our heads going like, whoa, what happened? Their costs can't have come down that much. And so it's a really interesting situation because SolarWorld and other American manufacturers, were and to a large extent still are being abused by, the Chinese market dominance policies, because you're talking about an economy, that operates as a single entity, right? You have China Inc. And, while there's other names and other things out there, it really is, China Inc. It was compounded by the fact that SunTech and some others had stolen IP from SolarWorld and other U.S. companies. So it's like we tend to in the industry paint them as the bad guy because they made the price of modules go up. But and if you'll forgive the analogy, it's a bit like blaming the cheerleader who got raped for the reason that your star player couldn't go to the NFL game. It's like it's not her fault. And so you had a lot of that. I mean, and it was that kind of feeling, right? It was like, hey, we're being abused here. This has got to stop. And I think where the real arguments came in and internally was not, no one thought that what was happening was right, but it was like, what's going to be an effective solution? And I think there was a camp that said, look, I mean, yeah, this is unfair, but there's something we can do about it, or we have to find other ways to compete. And then there was a camp that said, oh no, we should go and make some kind of legal case. And that largely came out of Germany. So you had the leadership, you had Frank Asbeck in charge, and he's kind of, wanting to be the Richard Branson of solar, as it were. Was really a character. And he had very strong views on this, and he was very politically connected. And so, you saw this kind of parallel effort in Europe and the US to basically say, hey, look, we got to tell China to stop. And, the result of that was, what a number of us had said it would be, is that, yeah, you're just going to basically raise prices for anybody. It's not ultimately going to help us. That's largely what happened. I do think that in some small ways, it has made the industry stronger, because those tariffs forced a lot of the supply chain to move out of China, which, has helped in a lot of other cases, as more tariffs get imposed. And as we had like with the pandemic, the first stages, where you couldn't get anything out of China. Well, a lot of solar companies it was really good that they had a plant somewhere else, maybe in Vietnam or Thailand or Singapore or where have you. These types of setbacks ultimately are what makes industries stronger. And like I said, I didn't agree with the decision. I left before they actually, implemented any of that. At the same time, I don't think that they were wrong to do so. It's just simply, that was the strategy they adopted. It ultimately didn't work, which is unfortunate. At the end of the day, I don't think we're materially worse off than we would have been otherwise.
It was a bit of the tail wagging the dog for a while. And certainly having been at the time working for other solar manufacturers, got to see various angles of how it played out in the macro environment of our industry. But agree, now 8 years on, it has been largely forgotten in lieu of other trade cases, frankly, and in lieu of the fact that the industry is just destined to be a majority of generation globally. There were a lot of different moving parts and pieces in the early 2010s, and it wasn't clear which sector of the industry was going to take off. Right, residential seemed to be growing well under the leadership of some of the name sort of well-known brands like SunRun and SolarCity and Sungevity even were gaining momentum. Vivint, et cetera. Utility looked like it might be poised to really take off from utility scale development, and then there were all the other services that sort of helped to provide a stable foundation for growth, like distribution. Companies like AEE and DC Power, now Solagent, and many others that we could name. In their heyday, they were really, really pumping. You mentioned David Katz had called you to AEE. I'd love to hear that story. You were there, if I recall correctly, all the way through the SunRun acquisition, correct? I'm wondering if you have some fun anecdotes of the ways that AEE grew and changed over the time you were there, and how the influence of SunRun even further sort of changed the face of what you saw as distribution in our industry.
Yeah, it was a fun time. I was actually at the 2010 Intrasolar conference, in San Francisco. We were debuting our ad campaign with Larry Hagman. So for those that remember, we had the Shine Baby Shine TV spots and everything. And I had been, part of organizing that, so I'm at the trade show. I literally hadn't slept in like 3 days. And the guy who was running, sales at the time for Solar World, who was sort of like my boss's boss. Anyway, he was like giving me a bad time because I missed some dinner or something. And I'm just looking at him like, what? And then, so I kind of like went for a walk to cool off a bit. And the first person I bumped into was David. And he says, hey, I need some marketing help. Would you consider coming over here? And I just said, yeah, let's talk. Nothing happened that day. It took another, 6 to 8 months before we got all the details ironed out. But yeah, the next spring I was over at AE and, moved up from, I was in Camarillo, moved up to San Luis Obispo, which is about the only better place you can go than Camarillo. AE had been through a lot. I mean, David Katz himself had bought and sold it like 4 different times. And so it had been kind of through the ringer. It's a very colorful organization. And, I kind of came in at really the beginning of the transition. And this is where I've often found myself in my career is, helping to take a company from, say 50, 60 employees and $10-15 million a year to, hundreds of employees and 50 to 100 million, or more in revenue. And this was kind of really one of those areas, went there originally as a product manager and was eventually given leadership of the technical support team, which, at that time at AE, I mean, it was really a legendary group, right? I had Brad Bassett, Brian Teitelbaum on the team. We had, I think, Barry Huseby, who's now at Snap and Rack. We had a lot of fun, right? Because here's a bunch of guys that really knew their stuff. I mean, Brian and Brad in particular had been in the industry for, 30 years and more, since it was an industry, really knew all the ins and outs and were just, great guys to work with. We even did our own podcast for a while called Rooftops and Wrenches.
Yeah. It was one of the original podcasts.
Yeah, it was sort of modeled after, because at the time it was, Energy Gang had taken off and there was this kind of NPR vibe to all the solar podcasts. And so we modeled ours after Car Talk.
I love it.
And it went pretty well. I mean, we actually ran it until I left the company, but I think they still host the episodes, so you can still get them if you're curious. And it was just kind of a question and answer show with, a lot of fun, interactions in the middle of it. Working with that team was really fantastic. And then, of course, as you mentioned, SunRun came along and acquired all of Mainstream. So for those that aren't aware, AE was part of a group called Mainstream Energy, which also owned REC Residential and REC Commercial. So our first hint of the acquisition was when Mainstream sold off REC Commercial. They spun it out as its own company. I guess it sold to Duke a few months after that. But we were just spinning it off, and it was kind of like, well, that's odd. I wonder why we're doing that. And then those that were more on the REC, residential side of the house, kind of had an inkling, and because they were actually SunRun's, biggest, supplier partner at that time. And we didn't have a lot of direct interaction with SunRun on the AE side until after the acquisition. What was interesting and really helpful for us is, you had a really well executed merger, and it was really the model for, these kind of synergistic mergers. Because you had SunRun, which at the time was really just a financing company. So you had all these really smart people up in San Francisco that knew how to get solar financed and, knew how to market it and really that end of things, And then you had on the Mainstream side, you had a bunch of people that were really good at supply chain, really good at construction, really good at sort of the operations side of the business. They, by and large, left everybody in place as far as what they were leading. Some of the titles changed, but the responsibilities, by and large, didn't. And they appointed a joint team to go and handle it all. Within about 6 months, I mean, everything was functioning pretty darn well. I mean, it wasn't all done, but like you felt like you were all part of one big company now. And AE increasingly became the supply chain backbone for SunRun, and we really worked to expand our relationship with SunRun's other channel partners. So even to this day, a lot of people aren't aware, SunRun doesn't do all of its own installs, right? It does maybe half of them. And then the rest are done by these channel partners, which are basically, large regional installers that have a relationship with SunRun and agree to, to source jobs and then sell them for the SunRun financing. And so as a distribution company, we were able to come in there and basically work with these guys. And some of the transactions, I mean, like we couldn't just like give them equipment. And then, because you had to sell them the equipment, you had to buy it back because otherwise the taxes and stuff didn't work out right. But we would work with them and like say, hey, these guys are big. They're credit worthy automatically because, we're paying them. So if they don't pay us, we don't pay them, So you had kind of that thing going for it, which allowed us to be a lot more generous in terms and things than they could get anywhere else. And again, no one has to buy from AE who's doing business with SunRun, but the idea was to make it really attractive to do so. And to a large extent, it worked pretty well. I mean, AE grew, just if you took just the distribution side of the business, grew quite a bit during that time. I don't think they wrote report AE out as a line item, so I haven't been able to follow it since then. But it's a growing part of the business. And, I was responsible for the catalog and for a lot of that kind of, what products go in, and increasingly worked with the SunRun team to determine what products they were going to use. As part of that, right after the acquisition, they had Lynn Jurek and Ed Fenster came down to San Luis Obispo to meet with some of us. And so they had, kind of one-on-one conversations with a number of people, and I got to be in one of those. And I kind of made the case. I said, look, we've got to be doing storage, right? It's, and at the time backup was the big thing, right? People want backup. We got to have a way to do that. And I increasingly I said, you're going to have this eventually for financial reasons anyway. Just looking at what's happening with net metering, with the grid and all this kind of stuff, because it was all kind of just starting back then. And that's a drum I was beating for many years, even prior to that. They turned out to be really receptive to it. In fact, Ed had been having conversations with, shareholders and others prior to that meeting. And he said, yeah, well, how much do we know about storage? And I said, AE's been doing this since, 1980 or earlier. And the UL standard for grid connected inverters was published in 1999.
Yeah.
And so he's like, okay, so you know how this works. We're like, yes, we know how this works. And that, it didn't take long before, I was tasked with, going and, negotiating the deal with Tesla and getting some of the stuff out, with the rest of the SunRun supply chain team. It was a lot of fun. We had a great time getting all that figured out and launching it.
Sounds like you were one of the early Brightbox initiators or catalysts inside of the SunRun team. That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was I got an email one day from the corporate counsel. So they wanted to name it Sunbox, and he said, well, there's this other product that I'm not sure about this, if this is going to be a problem. I'm looking at the other product, and it's not offered in the US, but it's a batteries, solar battery system, much smaller. I said, why don't you just call it Brightbox? We have Bright everything else. And he just kind of took that and ran with it. And then the next thing I saw a few weeks later, we're launching Brightbox. And I'm like, oh, cool.
That's great. You have a penchant. Yeah, you have a penchant for creating these moments in time where brands have a cornerstone marketing angle or tactic. That's pretty cool.
I mean, to me, that's how I get to contribute, right? And coming from a cog in the machine, as it were, there are some ways to influence those decisions and to build upon those strategies. Because business is ultimately about deploying a working strategy, and if you can come up with that working strategy, people will follow it. No, it's not like there's or there shouldn't be anyway, based on whose idea it was. It should be based on how good the idea is. And in really well-functioning companies, you find that that's the case. And I think SunRun is certainly an exemplar of, we'll run with the best idea regardless of where it came from.
Well, we introduced you as the director of product and market strategy for Outback. Many in our industry understand who Outback Power is. And Outback has itself gone through, as you mentioned, a similar phase of expansion and growth and acquisition. What led you to leave what was the fastest growing solar company in the world to go to a company that's kind of tried and true? Outback always has its niche in the market. Surely I have to imagine that there's something attractive about Outback and where they were looking to go that made them come to you and look for a new director of product management and made you say, well, maybe this is something that be worth me changing direction in my career right now.
AE went from being, I think, like 9 or 10 on Outback's customer list. And during my tenure there, we really started to engage with Outback. I mean, it went both ways. Brandon Provolenko, who was running, Outback sales at the time, he made a point to come down and engage with myself and others, personally, and really just kind of throw everything to the side and say, what's it going to take for us to dominate in this market through you? Finally, someone's listening, because we had tried to have this conversation with SMA and they weren't hearing it. And none of the guys that were there at SMA at the time are still there, in part, I think, because they didn't do that kind of listening. But yeah, the Outback guys came down. They were just like, let's figure out just some creative ways to go after this. And we came up with a number of joint activities. We started featuring them more at our, they took on a larger sponsorship role for AE's, distributor conferences and these kinds of events. And, and I hit the road and did a bunch of training on, why you should get into storage, right? Because for me, for a long time, it's been, you've got to have energy storage to make all this work. In the long run, I tend to look at things if everybody did X, would it be a good thing or a bad thing, right? And if everybody did solar, it's only a good thing up to a point, right? There's a point where now you've got all this solar on the grid that is not dispatchable, that, now you've got other problems. But if you put storage with it, now everybody can do it, and it's a net positive. And so, looking just from that very simplified perspective, I said, okay, the storage nexus is coming, right? And it's just marching inexorably toward that. And so when, Brandon called me up one day and said, hey, I need someone to run product management and get our next generation of products out there. They were at the time getting Skybox pretty close to launch, and, wanted me to come in and help them go from being an off-grid company to this broader energy management company. Because, here's an outfit that really understood batteries, really understands, power electronics, and understands what energy storage can do for customers. And so that was really what attracted me, was, opportunity to take more of a leadership role and to really drive that, as a business angle. And so, since then it's been about like, how do we get better at this? How do we get the next generation of products? And, what I'm excited about now is, the first products that are really started under my watch, are coming to fruition here in the next 12 months or so. And I think they're going to make an impact. Now having been acquired by EnerSys, which is a much larger company even than Alpha was, who was, the original parent company of Outback. We have a lot more resources around this. Now we have this giant battery company behind us, and the leadership there really sees the solution as, we're going to sell solutions. We're going to sell systems. We're not going to sell all these individual components and just wash our hands of it. We're going to offer, here's a complete system that you can buy. You want to buy the components? Fine, we'll sell you the components. But we really, we've got something here that'll make your life a lot easier. And I came to Outback to do that. I think we're definitely heading the right direction with it. And bumps in the road as always, but we're getting there.
I generally wonder how many people in the industry aren't familiar with EnerSys as a company, and why it was so important that, that Outback, this really well-known and well understood, as you pointed, off-grid company, for the most part. I mean, Outback has always had grid-tie products, but the off-grid market has been where Outback has just dominated for decades. Help me understand EnerSys and why it made sense for EnerSys to buy Outback, of the many, many companies they could have considered.
Yeah, and to be fair, EnerSys didn't acquire Outback by itself, right?
Sure,
EnerSys
they acquired Alpha, correct.
They acquired Alpha, but they quite easily could have spun Outback off, right? Or asked Alpha to do that, much in the way that SunRun had said, look, we don't want the commercial division. You need to spin that off before we acquire you.
For those who aren't familiar, I mean, EnerSys bills itself as the global leader in stored energy solutions for industrial applications, right? Like that statement alone says a lot about where EnerSys' focus has been and is. How old is the company?
So EnerSys has been around for, 20 years and change. The origination of the company actually goes all the way back to Thomas Edison.
Oh, wow.
So this was a series of battery companies, and then through different mergers and acquisitions is kind of now this very large, battery conglomerate, if you will. So you've heard like, Odyssey batteries and trucks, Hawker batteries for equipment. A lot of those brands, right? They're actually EnerSys brands. So you don't see them in the auto parts store, but there's a good chance that your battery, your starter battery you're buying at an auto parts store is a white label EnerSys battery, right? Because there's only so many companies that make all those batteries. And of course, EnerSys now working on the next generation of battery technology. And the good thing about it is you have a large multi-billion-dollar company that's working on this stuff, and it can bring a lot in terms of making sure things are safe, making sure that you can back up the warranties, making sure that the quality is there. These are things that the smaller startup companies just don't have the resources for. So that's where the real advantage of an EnerSys, comes in. And I think strategically, when they looked at Outback, they made a conscious decision to keep it. And part of the reason was they said, hey, here's a power electronics company that, is well established in the renewable space. We've got the off-grid niche to work from. And that was where a lot of the, alpha businesses and other the Intersys was interested in also, leverage that kind of off-grid space. We're powering the world, right? So it's the power you need anytime, anywhere, no matter what. And that's really what Intersys is all about. So Outback is the renewables arm of that, if you will. And to some extent, even the residential arm of that. So there's really a play there now in terms of growth. We're looking at it saying, hey, we can come into this grid-tied energy management space now where, we understand a lot more about energy storage than most of our competitors. We should be able to come in here and carve out a pretty good share of the market for ourselves and offer products that are really robust and yet economical at the same time. And so that's kind of where the focus is today is how do we create a system where, your cost of energy is the lowest, whether you're getting it from the battery or from the grid or for whatever, and we figure out how to make that happen.
Hey, for my commercial solar warriors out there, do you sometimes feel like prospects are treating you like a dollar per watt commodity? Instead of a race to the bottom, why not add more value to your proposals by including DemandX load flexibility software from Extensible Energy? You can use intelligent AI software to monitor solar production and shift the usage patterns of HVAC and other flexible loads. The result is increased savings on energy charges, demand charges, time of use charges, and that makes you and your proposal stand out from the crowd. Who doesn't want that? You can learn all about DemandX and how you can include load flexibility software as part of your proposals at extensibleenergy.com/suncast. And as a bonus, you'll get free load flexibility analysis, sales training, and info on how you can even white label DemandX for your solar company. So go ahead, stand out with DemandX from Extensible Energy. This episode is also brought to you by Adani Solar USA, a fully integrated renewables company from solar cell and module manufacturing to project ownership and operation. Adani has an impressive operating and contracted pipeline of over 14 gigawatts of solar energy projects and recently received the largest solar award ever of 8 gigawatts. It's mind-blowing. And it includes a single site project of 2 gigawatts, which itself is tied for the world's largest. No one knows mega-scale projects like Adani. If you'd like to work with Adani, go to mysuncast.com/Adani, ADANI, and fill out the information request form, and we'll put you in touch with their local team. We're seeing this, which we alluded to, spoke in detail about in the Tactical Tuesday, this move towards batteries as a grid asset. Many of your predictions sort of allude to both the future of AC and DC coupling and the retrofit versus new build markets. How, within the context of Intersys, this huge storage concern, do you all see the world from the perspective that batteries are now a grid asset? Like, how do we complement this concept of off-grid versus grid tie as a go forward? Is more R&D being spent in battery chemistry or in software, or where do you see that impetus?
Yeah, I think we've made a lot of investments in battery chemistry, our Intersys individually and as an industry. And I think that the real, next level of investment is, as you said, in the software. How do we make these systems talk to each other? I spend a lot of time with our engineering team and with organizations like SunSpec and others, trying to make sure that, as we launch all these virtual power plants and other kind of grid asset mobilization types of networks, that we're all speaking the same language, that, the stuff can all talk to each other. So we've kind of gone away from having this, proprietary communications to where, going forward, everything's SunSpec compliant, IEEE 2030.5 compliant, all these kind of basic industry standards that allow for intercommunication, right? So if you want to have an Outback product here, maybe an SMA product over here, or a SolarEdge product over there, there's a way we can all talk to each other and function on the same grid and provide aggregated services. And so we're pushing for that type of ecosystem. And then it's basically whoever builds the best equipment for the money wins.
It seems like an oversimplification, whoever builds the best systems for the money, when there are so many different flavors of system that the market says they need, right? As you pointed out, residential versus C&I, versus utility backup. I mean, storage is going to be integrated into our world in a way that solar could only hope to. In the same way that storage is integrated into our world already, the storage in my watch and the storage in my computer are not the same fundamental technology. They're based on a similar chemistry. Yeah, it's really interesting and complex world that we're faced with right now, where as an industry, we've been by and large hardware focused for 50 years, right? As we all know, software is eating the world. In every other category, software is the multiplier effect. So I'm going to be really curious to see how software and energy products continue to intermesh and intertwine. Do you guys offer either now or move in the future products in other parts of the world, namely Latin America, where a bunch of our listeners are? But like, where and how do you compete with, say, the Enphase and Solar Edges of the world, or the, even the straight battery companies? I'm thinking like, Generac bought Pika. Like, where does Outback position itself in the market, and how available outside of the U.S. market are your products?
We're not as strong outside the North America as we are inside of it. But that said, we do have a reasonably good presence in Latin America.
And that's for storage and power conversion? Yeah,
so mostly power conversion, just because of our legacy products. And we've made a number of deals with different battery companies over the years. Increasingly, though, now with Intersys, we're leveraging the Intersys batteries, which allows us to have a much more uniform offering worldwide. Yeah, we've been really strong in the Caribbean for a long time. And it's really because if you have, say, a half a grid, as it were, so let's say you're in Haiti or you're in some place where the grid is only on for so many hours a day. We've done a lot of systems historically where you didn't even have to have solar. You would just charge the batteries from the grid while you had it, and then it would give you power at night. That was actually a really major use case. And I think even to this day in those kind of markets, increasingly, as you put the solar on there, the solar is cheap enough now that why wouldn't you? And it allows you to go further. So if the grid doesn't come on the next day for some reason, you're okay, because you can still charge the batteries. And it's this idea that we can connect to a grid that's not very strong, or a grid that has, not a great waveform. We take for granted in the US and in Europe and other places where, the grid conforms to a pretty solid standard. That's not the case in most of the world. So you've got grids that, okay, nominally say it's 50 hertz. It might be 55, 56 hertz for a while, and then it's 48. And then, it kind of goes back and forth, or the voltages might swing. Our legacy equipment is known for being able to handle those kinds of issues and being able to either stay connected or reconnect quickly enough and for long enough to make a difference. It's that sense of, I'm going to have power no matter what, and I'm going to have the cheapest power. Interestingly, that's what we're kind of bringing back to the US now, as the US grid is less and less stable because it's aging and different things are getting done to it. The PSPS in California is a great example where, hey, we're just going to turn the grid off for a couple of days so that we don't start a wildfire. You don't want to be someone that's having to live without power, especially right now during a shelter-in-place order of a pandemic, and all this kind of stuff. We're already seeing, that situation develop in your neck of the woods with hurricane season, right? So people are really freaking out. And we're bringing that kind of power independence, which people in the US and in Canada never really thought they needed before. But this is all par for the course in Latin America, or in Africa, or in Australia, or a lot of the other places that we've done business. And so it's interesting that we're kind of bringing those values, here where no one thought they needed them. That's where, I think we can bring a lot to the table, because we do have so much experience working in those kinds of environments.
Super interesting. We talked about, you said that the focus of software and that chemistry is pretty well nailed down. But historically, Outback has been used to couple predominantly lead acid batteries for off-grid systems. As I look at the product offering on your energy storage page there, I don't see a lot of diversification away from lead. Is there an argument in favor or of different chemistries, or how do you see that piece of the storage argument or conversation shaking out?
So we are working on some lithium-ion offerings, so that you'll see those before too long. But really, this idea that the whole lead is dead idea, I think is misguided. There are applications where lithium-ion makes more sense, and there are applications where lead acid makes more sense. So, for example, if you're doing a strict time of use or something like that, where you're going to be cycling the battery every day, and you're otherwise on the grid and you don't have a lot of extremes, a lithium-ion battery is probably going to perform better in that situation. There are ways to do it with lead carbon batteries that are cheaper up front. But, honestly, if I do the math, a good low cost lithium ion battery is going to be better economically over the long term. On the flip side, if all you care about is standby, which was most of the market until pretty recently, then lead acid batteries are much better and they'll even last longer. Because a lead acid battery, it likes to just sit there being fully charged and what we call in float, so those are familiar with the terminology, which means you're just giving it kind of a trickle charge at its high voltage over time. Takes just a little bit of power, so it's a little bit of parasitic there, but it'll stay in that condition for 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the battery. Whereas if you do that to a lithium ion battery and just leave it in float for even 3 years, most batteries today you'll avoid the warranty, and very few of them will live much longer than that. Despite the fact that you paid twice as much for it. It's about the right battery for the right application, and this is the approach that we take. Is even before the acquisition, it's not about one chemistry versus another chemistry. It's about choosing the right chemistry for the right application, because there are so many little differences and little things here and there. One of the things that came up in a conversation with some of our engineers over in Reading on the battery side was, there's a whole debate right now around, oh, well, you have, these LFP batteries and, they're safer or they're whatever because they don't have cobalt. And it's like, well, okay, the safer is more debatable, but no one's going to recycle a battery that doesn't have cobalt in it, which I had never heard that before. And I was like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense. Because if you look at, say, the lead acid battery space, lead acid batteries are almost completely recycled. It's one of the most recycled products on the face of the earth. And in fact, when you buy a lead acid battery, it's mostly recycled content, everything from the lead to the plastic. Not so lithium ion today. There are relatively few opportunities to recycle lithium ion batteries, and mostly they're around recapturing some of those rare materials. Lithium by itself isn't such a valuable material. It's relatively common. But when you start having, cobalt and titanium, some of these other things that are in the chemistry, now it becomes much more financially interesting to recycle them. And so there's a lot more effort put into that. So, so this guy's prediction was that we're going to see much more advanced recycling for nickel manganese cobalt batteries before we'll see it for lithium iron phosphate. The conversation at the time was around, well, we can make the NMC battery just as safe because, even your LFPs will have thermal runaway if you don't design them properly and use them within spec. We're having, these are the kinds of conversations we're having. And the advantage is that nobody's like, oh, it's my chemistry or die. It's like, we've got a whole building full of chemists. We'll figure that part out.
One of the things I'm curious about, as there are a lot of battery startups in the world right now, is where does EnerSys think about strategic investment? Obviously, have had a number of successful acquisitions, including Alpha and North Star. But is there an internal skunkworks at EnerSys that looks at being a strategic and investing in some of these smaller battery companies that are out there trying to make it and that are creating their own hardware and software?
Not that I'm at liberty to talk about. Obviously, there's the message to those of us in management is, if you see something that makes a good acquisition, let's go talk about it. As far as there being a specific, secretive group of people doing that, I can't say. But I do know that, if a good suggestion comes up from, someone like on my team, for example, it'll get a hearing. And I think that's important. In any company that you're working with, if you can't get ideas from any quarter to get a hearing, if they're good ideas, then then there's a problem.
One of the things you and I talked about a little bit offline, and just because it's pertinent to where we're all at in the world right now, I'm curious to know what you see as things being affected broadly by the pandemic and the potential global recession, things that we discussed like public power safety shutoffs or public safety power shutoffs during the stay at home. Can you comment on kind of from your vantage point what you see happening broadly in our industry as a result of the pandemic?
My take on it is as good or bad as anyone else's, I suppose. We've obviously seen a bit of a downturn just as people are unable to go out and install stuff. Our product depends on an infrastructure of contractors who are going into people's homes and installing equipment. Obviously, that's more difficult right now. The interesting counter trend to that is we're hearing about a lot more interest, right? So people are really thinking, now that they're in their homes all the time for months on end, and thinking about these impending, hurricane season, wildfire season, everyone's got a disaster season of some kind. People are thinking really hard about, hey, what happens if I don't have any power? It's not like I can go to the shelter because I'll get the plague if I go to the shelter. So what do we do? And so it's interesting because I have a feeling that once areas start to open up, and I think we've seen some of this, in the areas that have opened up a little bit, like in the Southeast and so forth, there's a bit of an uptick where people are like, hey, I just realized I need this. I'm going to get it done now while I still can. Because you never know when, the economy could very well go into lockdown again if there's another round of infections, which, is as likely as not at this point. So, people are starting to think about it. There's a little bit of that ticking clock. The other thing working against us is, if you're afraid for your job or your source of income, whatever it happens to be, your business, you're going to back off on those kinds of investments, or at least you're going to think about them longer. So it's hard to say what the net effect is. I think in the end, we're going to come out of this. So there'll be a little bump to make up for lost time. And then we'll be back largely on the trajectory we were on before, if not a little bit better. That's about as much as I can see in the future on that point at this point.
Paul, you, as I recall, come from an entrepreneurial family, yet you are very much an intrapreneur working within a larger system. I'd love to get your perspective on the difference that you see between being an entrepreneur, starting your own company, versus being an intrapreneur, joining a large company with, the resources that come along with that.
Yeah, like I said, my parents ran a delicatessen when I was young. Didn't go particularly well. There were good years and bad years, but it ultimately led to a lot of trouble. It sort of gave me a real kind of warning about, hey, if you're going on your own, you've got to do these things. And as I went into my MBA program, it was a very entrepreneurial focused program. We were literally across the street from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So it was a great program from that point of view. We got to go, one of the summer projects was, we went over across the street, we looked at several technologies, we picked one and wrote a plan to commercialize it. And then we took the plan around and did business plan competitions. And it was really interesting and a lot of fun. But as part of that program, every week we were meeting different entrepreneurs. And, one of the themes that I picked up on, whether it was just because of my own bias or what have you, but it's like, these are all people who either didn't have a family or sacrificed their family to build their business. And, I just wasn't comfortable making that trade-off. So, that was, I think, a big part of it that I should, put out there as, this is my bias and where I'm coming from. That said, I mean, if I look at it today, I'm in a different place today, I probably could. But the kinds of things that I want to do, I want to build, power electronics, energy storage systems, things like that. It's not that kind of stuff that you can do on a shoestring, so it's really hard to be, the best you could do as a startup in that space would be to get some engineers and then go have someone in China build all the stuff for you. I'm not a huge fan of, referencing our earlier part of the conversation, I'm not a huge fan of doing that. And so I would much rather work with, a US based company that has the resources. I can, in my current role, I can write up a requirements document and talk to customers, make sure that, I can design the product from a sort of features and benefits point of view. And I can hand that off to a very competent engineering team that can go make it a reality. And then I can focus on, okay, what else am I going to need around this product? How am I going to launch it and do all the sort of business stuff without having to, at the same time, worry about how I'm going to make payroll or worry about how I'm going to pay the taxes or, it's a more, the kind of specialization of labor. The trade-off is, obviously I'm not in charge, right? So I can't go and make the rules. And you have to learn to work within the rules and the culture of the company that you're in. But I have found, everywhere I've been that there are opportunities to have a lot of influence, if you can bring a good case, if you're good at making your case and you can show how it's going to result in revenues, profits, and all the things that business leaders are looking for, or even just satisfied customers, here's how we're going to make our customers this much more happy and improve their lives by doing X. You can get a hearing. And in most well-run companies, the good ideas will float to the surface and they'll get executed. And, and if you find that that's not happening, then that's a sign that you're probably not in the kind of company you should be in. And, granted that, the situation we're in now is not ideal for for making those kinds of changes, but there are times when it's opportune to make those kinds of changes, and people will do that. I know I've done that a couple of times when it became necessary. But yeah, I think I see myself as working for the industry and working for the customers of our industry in particular. How do I make people more energy independent? And I'm going to align with whatever company will help me do that.
Reflecting on that and seeing that you leveraged, which many of us do, leverage the moment to kind of go back and get an MBA and get training skills to then take a new direction in career. What do you see were the main, and I'll say this also within the context that I and many others, despite the fact that I have an MBA, I'm a naysayer on the value of higher education beyond a college degree unless there's a really, really specific application for it. So I'm really curious from your perspective, having gone through the same process, what you see as the main benefits that you gleaned from your MBA as it pertains to your career.
Yeah, I mean, there's an experience that you go through, but more than anything, going after that MBA, it builds up in you and it demonstrates a discipline that not everybody has. So if I'm hiring people, for example, I expect to see a certain difference when I see an MBA on someone's resume versus someone that doesn't have one. And experience doesn't always make up for that. Sometimes it does. There are people like I said. I mean, Brad Bass is actually a great example, and I hope he doesn't mind me using his name like this. But here's a guy who doesn't have a technical degree. He's not a degreed engineer, but I would trust his opinion over most degreed engineers because he's shown through the experience that he has that discipline, that he has that rigor. And an MBA is and any other advanced degree is really in essence a shortcut to that judgment, right? Is saying I have this discipline, I've done the work. So people that have these advanced degrees, they're much more likely to have done the homework. And it's not universally true. Like nothing is universally true. When you're in the business and you're hiring people and you're looking at experience and qualifications, it's a decent signpost. I found on the whole, people who have it are much more likely to have that discipline than people that don't. And I know that's the big thing I got out of it was just, proving to myself that I could do this. Now, there's always, of course, the experience angle of, you're on campus. I got to, like I said, met different entrepreneurs every week, from guys at Boeing and Hewlett Packard to the guy that sold ash from Mount St. Helens, after the eruption, who was the most fun, by the way. Meeting those kinds of people and getting involved in those kinds of networks. And again, people ask about, what's the value of a big school? I think there are some ways that the big school education is better, but the real advantage is that they come out with these networks. And, the Stanford, Harvard, Yale type of networks are really, really powerful. And I kind of wish I had more access to that. But that's the value of the schooling. And I think it's possible to see without it, but it's a lot harder.
Your anecdote about Brad also reminds me of another guest I've had on the show, and friend of mine, Tristan, over at PVL, who has run the PV module business for DNVGL, now PVL, and he's a non-technical business leader who commands great respect in the market. He worked at Silfab as a quality manager with no prior engineering experience, leading a team of quality engineers. So I can definitely identify with exactly what you're pointing to there for the innate ability that some folks have and that others sort of skip to the front of the line, as you said, a shortcut with the MBA to get that credibility on the business side. One of the other things that I find that has been hugely valuable for me going through the MBA process and the various jobs that I've had after that is that of having mentors in my life. And I wonder, what are some key, you work for David Katz, for God's sake, of so many people in your life that you've been influenced by. What are some key lessons or takeaways that you have from some of these important leaders and mentors in your career?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, David and Raju and others, taught me directly. I think I learned most of what I know about the solar market and how it all works, from Raju and just, conversations that we would have. And he's a really great guy because he's argumentative, but in a more of a lighthearted way. So if you really want to work through an issue, he's a great person to talk to about it, because he'll kind of poke and prod and, well, have you thought about this and what about that? And just enjoys that kind of conversation, which really helped me to learn. Plus he introduced me to a lot of folks, including David and Coley and those guys, because he's been their supplier for all these years, right? And then, and then with someone like David Katz, it's like you learn more by just watching him and some of the things that we were, he was the guy before I got there. I mean, he was kind of managing the product assortment. And so hiring me was sort of how he got to, free up his time to go do other stuff, which I think suited him fine. But yeah, we used to have a fair number of conversations around like what kind of product should we focus on and what are the trends. I mean, so he's the one that really helped me spot early on this trend toward storage, the trend toward microelectronics on PV modules. He had actually theorized an AC battery back in 1980 something. So we have all these just crazy things that because here's a guy who's electrical engineer, worked for the Air Force right before he got into to solar. And for those that have met him, would not picture him as a civilian Air Force employee. So, yeah. But then looking at kind of what happened with these guys and what directions their careers took or their businesses took, different people are good at different things. Like I said, Raju was great at sort of running a business and strategizing and making sure that everything was set up correctly, and very loyal. I mean, like I said, he worked at that factory through 3-4 different owners. And, never really complained, just did the job and made sure everything was working as well as it could, so he did okay. And then you look at someone like David Katz, who, made most of his money buying and selling, companies and just being at the right place at the right time and kind of orchestrating these very innovative deals and technologies, but not an operations guy. Like I love David to death. I would never put him in charge of managing the company on a day-to-day basis, because that's just not his skill set, right? There are other people that are good at that. So you get someone like Raju to do that. And you get someone like David to be like the visionary and go figure out how to do this. And just realizing from, all these kinds of folks that not everybody can be good at everything. You've got to figure out what your strengths are and play to your strengths. And I think that was an important lesson for me. I've gone through my career as much of a generalist as you can, trying to be fairly good at everything. And I think it's held me back in some ways that, I haven't kind of played to very particular strengths, but I have found that, in part from talking to these guys, when I play to my strengths, I do really, really well. And I think that that's true for most people. You have to figure out what you're good at, and you're not going to figure that out by introspection alone. You've got to talk to people and get feedback. Otherwise you're going to end up thinking you're good at something that you're not, or vice versa. That part of it, I mean, that was the big takeaway for me is, and we tend to lionize a lot of people in the industry, particularly the pioneers and stuff. And, having gotten to know them, you're like, they deserve a lot of credit for what they did and the chances they took and the things that they stood for. But these are imperfect people, just like every other imperfect person, and there's no reason why anybody else can't go and do something on the order of what they did. So that's encouraging too. And I think I see it a lot in our industry in particular, just the sense of, so-and-so's, the Messiah, and we'll never, be as good as that. The reality is, no, they're not. They're very focused. And you find when you talk to them that what they had to pay in terms of time, treasure, and talent to get where they are and to do what they did. And I've always been most impressed by the people. I mean, a good example is Jess Fees, who I met. He was at AE while I was at Solar World, and then he had left AE about the time that I joined. But, he's been a good friend of mine, and we worked together on a lot of regulatory stuff, things that basically you would look at what Jeff and what he does and be like, what does this have to do with your business and building up your career? And, and I think the answer honestly is nothing. I want to see the industry built up. So I always had a lot more respect for people like that who say, look, I'm here to accomplish something. And when I interview people, that's one of the questions that I typically ask for early on is like, tell me what you want to accomplish. Like, I don't care about where you want to be in 5 years. I want to know what you want to have accomplished in 5 years. Like, what did you do for the industry? What did you do for the company? What did you do for the world? And the people that can answer those kinds of questions coherently are typically much more interesting.
I really appreciate that reflection, and certainly that question. I think it's one that we should all ask ourselves: what do we want to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years? We have a terrible ability to predict what's going to happen over the next year, and we often overstate what we can accomplish in 3 to 6 months, and vastly understate what we can accomplish in 3 to 10 years. I've had that same experience with Jeff. I just find Jeff extremely interested in raising the tide, not necessarily elevating the level of his boat. It's always a fascinating conversation when I get to hang out with Jeff and so many who are like him, which really constitute the ethos of our industry by and large. And certainly those of us who've been in the industry long enough to have considered it a career rather than those who are kind of looking at it as the new hot market or the new next best thing. Yeah, I really appreciate that reflection. That caused a flood of memories for me of things that I've similarly encountered in my career. I'm curious, Paul, as we start to turn towards home base here, what's got you most excited about where clean energy as an industry is going?
We are either at or really quickly approaching that sort of tipping point, right? Where the things that we've been doing for the last 20 years or so, and longer in some cases, are becoming more and more common sense. Like, well, if you ask most people on the street today, well, of course we should have more solar energy. Yeah, energy storage sounds like a great idea. We should do more of that. Yeah, I like the idea of having control over my own energy supply and how I interact with the utility. I think the tide of consumer opinion is on our side. I wrote another article recently talking about how one of the more important things we've seen is the codes and standards and regulations are establishing now to say, hey, look, an energy storage system is part of the home building code. It doesn't necessarily say that you have to have one, but at least it prescribes if you're going to have it. It's like an air conditioner. If you're going to have it, do it like this. That's actually a really, really good thing, because it means that people in a broad sense want this, and we want to have a formulaic way for them to get it. Yeah, I'm excited about that kind of stuff.
I'm going to definitely link to that article, by the way, where you point out the three signs that batteries, energy storage in particular, is mainstream. I think that your writing style in particular, I really appreciate.
Oh, thank you. I work hard on it. So
yeah.
That's why I'm excited. This is finally something that's been so niche for so long. For the first, 10, 15 years of my career, I couldn't, I could try to explain to my, my mother or my grandmother, what I'm doing, but they didn't get it. Oh, okay, solar panels, that's cool, whatever. And I think we're approaching the time when, people like them that aren't into this stuff, that aren't energy wonks, can at least look at it and say, oh, you make those things. Oh yeah, okay, I understand. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they've at least seen it and they know that it fits over here. So, getting a box is not necessarily the end of the world. It's the beginning of something bigger in some cases.
I wonder, Paul, as you reflect on the way that you internalize information, I'm curious if you default to books or podcasts. How do you inform yourself?
I read a lot of books. I haven't as much in the last couple of years. I try to read, business book every month or two. I've increasingly gone to audiobooks and podcasts. Podcasts have been big for me. I went to a work from home arrangement a little over a year ago, and so I have less time on commute. But I'll listen to your podcast, for example, or Energy Gang or some other ones. When I'm working in my shop, or whether I'm just kind of sitting around having breakfast or something. In sort of the down times where otherwise I'm just sort of doing something with my hands that's sort of mindless. It helps to have some learning going on at the same time, A, so I don't get bored, and B, because it's edifying. And I've gotten a lot out of podcasts, and I think that's kind of what got me into audiobooks, was just hey, I'm kind of getting used to now absorbing this information by listening. I'd always been before more of a visual learner, and I found that I just don't have the time to sit and read anymore like I used to. And this gives me a way to do that while I'm taking care of other things that otherwise I wouldn't have time to do it.
It's categorically why I listen to audiobooks and podcasts, mostly because I'm a runner, and I also chronically am up washing dishes or cleaning the house around 11 o'clock at night, and so it's easy to just pop that in
exactly.
And go about your chores, or your exercise. I have a question that I've been asking folks offline. I don't think I've ever asked this online or on an interview. What do you look for? Given that everyone who's listening to this right now clicked the link and started listening because something appealed to them. What do you look for as a podcast listener that makes you say, oh, I'll listen to that episode?
It depends. So if it's a podcast I'm not familiar with, then I'll look for what's the subject matter and, who's being interviewed and where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. In most cases, I tend to stick with particular credible sources. So like your podcast, for example, or say mm-hmm. Energy Gang or Interchange or one of those.
But then how do you decide what episode to listen to? If I've got 260 episodes, when someone...
Yeah, I haven't gone to none of your back catalog, I have to confess. I've done that on a couple of other podcasts that weren't solar related. In your case, I listen to most of yours. If I don't listen to it, it's usually because it's either someone whose story I already know pretty well, and it isn't terribly relevant to me for other reasons. But by and large, I like this interview approach and the kind of question and answer. I'm not a huge fan of podcasts with just one voice. The only exception to that would be Dan Carlin's Hardcore History.
Oh, for sure.
But I like the conversational format. I like the my favorite is podcasts where you have two people who are disagreeing, maybe like a moderated discussion or something. I find those really compelling because it really, regardless of the content. I mean, my all-time favorite is actually a British Christian radio show where they have people arguing about religion, and I really enjoy it because the points that they make in the end, these are typically very educated people who know their topics and are very cordial, and so they're just discussing their differences and making points and counterpoints, and you're learning how to think and how to absorb this information and how to spot faulty claims. Just sort of what's the art of argumentation, as it were. And so to me, those kinds of things are really interesting, and it helps you really dig through a topic and sort out all the different sides. And regardless of who won the conversation, because you might have somebody who's more rhetorically skilled than someone else, and they may sound like they had the better hand of the conversation. But when you go back and think about it, it's like, well, they missed this point, and this point just because their interlocutor wasn't up to the same level. Eventually, you learn to kind of spot these things and to see where there's maybe a fallacy in their argument or something like that. So I find any kind of podcast that makes me think and that helps me learn how to think better, regardless of the topic, I find really valuable.
You mentioned that you have read a lot in the past. Is there a book in particular that you gift a lot or that you recommend to folks that you find helps inform your worldview or your leadership style, or has influenced you and pushed you in some way?
There's a number of them that I like. Lately I've been recommending to people in my organization, Who, which is a book on how to hire. And unfortunately, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But if you just look up the Who book, you'll find it. One that I recommend to a lot of people who are, especially in the entrepreneurial world, is an old one called The E-Myth by Michael Gerber.
Of course, yeah.
And this is one that I read early on, and it really made the point for me that if you're going to build a business, you have to build a business, not a job. And the book does a great job. I mean, you can read it in an afternoon. It's a really short book, but it tells you the difference between building a business and owning a job. If I decide to hang a shingle tomorrow and be a consultant, I would own a job.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe that's okay. If that's what you want to do, nothing wrong with it. But that's not building a business, right? That's owning a job.
Yeah.
Whereas, going and building something or building out a service organization where you have, people that work for you, and his litmus was, can you franchise it?
Ah, wow. I didn't realize that was.
Yeah, which I thought was really brilliant take on it. And that was how, talking about the business plan competition that I did during my MBA program, I had read this book around that time. It gave me the idea to franchise, the business model we came up with was a franchised home inspection system built around a technology that could see through walls. And so, because that was the technology we were looking at. It's the same, by the way, you go to the airport and you do the scanner, if not the X-ray or not the metal detector, but you have to go through the scanner. It's that technology. They invented that there at the laboratory, and they wanted to apply it to other markets. And so the market we picked was kind of building inspection, and that was how we decided to do it. Was as a franchise. We basically sell the tools on a kind of franchise basis where you'd pay so much a month to have the tools, and then go out and we figured we could proliferate it a lot faster that way.
The book, by the way, is The Who, The A Method for Hiring by Jeff Smart and Randy Street. And of course, we link to all of these in our show notes at mysuncast.com. Do you ever check that out? I mean, I recommend tons of books.
Yeah, I find I've read probably 30 to 40% of them.
Fantastic. Yeah.
I pick up a few more wherever I can. I read Thinking Fast and Slow recently, which was a really interesting one.
Is there a particular habit or consistent practice that for you gives you an area of focus or impact in your life that you wouldn't otherwise get?
I think about your purpose. There's a lot of things you can do on a day-to-day basis that help you get better at stuff, like listening to podcasts, as we've talked about. But none of that's going to help you if you don't know what you want to accomplish. So I think, and I find, the annual vacation is a great time to do this, to kind of sit down, block out at least a day and just kind of very relaxed, casually, sit down and go, okay, what have I finished? Like what have I accomplished? And then what's next? And if you think about what like I said, I try to focus on what do you want to accomplish in the next, year, 3, 5 years. And knowing what that is helps you align everything else that you're doing. Am I in the right role for that? Am I at the right company for that? Am I building the right skills for that? And so on. And so, for me, it's about just identifying, what's that next thing going to be? For me, it's, I want to see energy storage become absolutely ubiquitous, right? And so, I try to think about what's the next thing that I can do, right? So for now, until I get it done, it's, get the right product out on the market. So I'm hoping to be able to say in the next year or so that I've done that. And then it's going to be, how do I, build on that and make that product more popular? And what do I follow it up with? How do I build an ecosystem for all this to work better?
That's very inspiring. I like that. And yeah, you mentioned doing it on the annual vacation. My question was particularly, is there anything that is a habit, so something you do every day? But my assumption underlying it is that this is something that, in fact, is a core driver for you. It's something that you think about on a regular basis, if not daily, then certainly weekly. Am I driving towards my accomplishment? So I think that is a real clarity. And I find that, unfortunately, it's one that far too few people have in their career, in their life.
It's easy to get caught up in the noise.
Yeah.
And I think especially in our society, and that's one of maybe the silver linings of, this whole situation we're in these days, is it's forcing a lot of people to stop and think about, what am I really doing here?
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. That's a very good point. Paul, you have been published a couple of times now lately in PB Magazine. Where else can people find you, your writing, your thinking? Are you proliferated on Twitter or LinkedIn, or is it best for them to just kind of find you on LinkedIn and message you? Or how can folks get more of Paul Dailey?
Well, I'm not on Twitter, and that's very intentional. I philosophically disagree with the idea that you can have meaningful conversations in 250 characters. But I try to post everything that I publish on my LinkedIn page, just so that it's easy, one-stop shop to go and find all of that. So you can usually find any of that there. Of course, the outbackpower.com blog, you'll find some of that stuff there.
Well, let's end today, Paul, after what has been a really phenomenal conversation I've enjoyed immensely, with what we call the bold prediction. You're a listener, so you know what's coming. What one thing do you see happening, Paul, in our market or in markets to come that maybe nobody else is tracking? What's in your crystal ball?
Well, we covered 10 of them earlier.
Yes, we did.
But I think, as a whole, I really do see, energy storage becoming, if nothing less, a necessary component for PV. And I think we'll see both become nearly ubiquitous by the end of the decade.
Fantastic. I will certainly be tracking that here on Suncast, and we'll be bringing you back in to talk a little bit more later in the year when some of these world-changing products that you're working on come to market. Paul Dailey is the Director of Product and Market Strategy for Outback Power, subsidiary of Enersys, global giant for storage solutions. Paul, thanks so much for coming back on Suncast. Look forward to seeing you soon, friend.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, what a truly inspiring story. I love having conversations with guys like Paul who have really been around the block. They've had a chance to navigate the ins and outs of our industry and have successfully taken steps to increasing their responsibility and purview in the industry. And I'm so grateful to know you, Paul. Thank you for being on the show. Well, I hope that you're more prepared than ever to take the energy transition on with renewed vigor, strength, and insight. It's great to have a podcaster like Paul in the virtual studio with me today and take that walk down memory lane, which I'm sure has stirred up fond emotions and sparked new ideas for you all. But did it resonate with you? How about let me know over on LinkedIn? I love reading your takeaways when you share them, as some of you are prone to do. You share them with me and your community. You're so giving, and I love that. I'll be sure to jump in, as always, with a like and a comment, and I hope that you'll do the same. Now, if you're eager to keep learning, then as always, my fellow Philomath, I invite you to check out the resources and highlights from this and every other discussion over on mysuncast.com. There you'll find the social media links, book recommendations, and so much more from these dialogues with the titans of industry. And hey, while you're there, as I mentioned earlier, it really does give me great insight and joy to read your answers to our listener survey. Would you take a few more minutes at mysuncast.com and fill out that survey so that we have a better understanding of how we can serve you? And lastly, if you're new to the industry or just looking for ways to network more, I would encourage you to look no further than our Clean Energy Guild over on Facebook. Now, I know some of you aren't even using Facebook, so why not just bookmark the Clean Energy Guild and make that the only networking option you have outside of LinkedIn? That's basically what I do. It's a network where myself and hundreds of other clean energy professionals are networking and communicating all about what's happening in the industry. We also have exclusive live trainings, mentorship, and guild-only guides. We're putting stuff in there just about every week now, so I hope you'll jump over and check it out and get your latest guide on all the fancy tools I use to maximize my output and minimize my inputs. Remember, you are what you listen to, Solar Warrior. So thanks again for showing up. It's half the battle.